The cold steel of the handcuffs bit deep into his wrists as the patrolman slammed his head against the hood of the cruiser. "You people always think you can just do whatever you want," the officer sneered, fully believing he had just bagged a nobody on a dark, lonely highway. What this arrogant cop didn't realize was that the quiet, fiercely calm black man bleeding onto the police car wasn't a nobody. He was a highly decorated, active-duty Special Operations commander, and his men were listening to the entire encounter on an open comms line. What happens next won't just end a few police careers. It will summon the absolute earth-shaking wrath of the United States military right to their front doors. Stick around, because the karma in this story is swift, brutal, and absolutely unforgettable. The rain was coming down in sheets across State Route 119, drumming a steady, hypnotic rhythm against the roof of the restored 1974 Ford Bronco. Behind the wheel sat Isaiah Crawford. He was dressed in a faded gray zip-up hoodie and a pair of worn denim jeans, looking every bit like a tired construction worker heading home after a grueling double shift. But Isaiah was not a construction worker. He was Colonel Isaiah Crawford of the United States Army, a man who had spent the last 2 decades leading elite special forces teams through the most hostile environments on the planet. He held 3 silver stars, a Purple Heart, and the unwavering, almost terrifying loyalty of the men and women under his command of the nearby Fort Henry. Tonight, however, he was just a father driving back from the city after picking up a custom-made necklace for his daughter's 16th birthday. In the rearview mirror, a pair of headlights surged forward through the blinding rain, closing the distance at an aggressive speed. Suddenly, the sky flashed with blinding red and blue strobes. Isaiah glanced at his speedometer. Third. He was going exactly 45 miles per hour in a 50 zone. His tags were up to date, his taillights were functioning, and his driving was textbook perfect. A deep, familiar instinct flared in his chest, the instinct of a man who knew exactly how the world worked outside the uniform. He activated his turn signal, pulled the heavy Bronco smoothly onto the muddy shoulder, and shifted into park. He turned off the engine, rolled down his window to let the freezing rain blow in, and placed both of his large, calloused hands squarely at the 10 and 2 positions on the steering wheel. Behind him, the doors of the patrol cruiser opened. 2 figures stepped out into the downpour. Officer Brandon Lawson approached the driver's side with his hand already resting menacingly on the grip of his service weapon. Lawson was a man whose entire personality was built around the badge pinned to his chest. He was known in the department for a short temper and a deeply ingrained arrogance. His partner, Officer Derek Cobb, a younger, nervous man who blindly followed Lawson's lead, flanked the passenger side of the Bronco, shining a high-powered maglite directly into Isaiah's face. License, registration, and insurance. Now, Lawson barked over the sound of the rain, leaning his face uncomfortably close to the window. Isaiah blinked against the blinding beam of the flashlight, his voice deep, measured, and entirely devoid of fear. "Good evening, officer. My license is in my wallet, which is in my back right pocket. My registration and insurance are in the glove compartment. How would you like me to proceed?" Mark Lawson scoffed, clearly irritated by the precise, unbroken composure of the man in the driver's seat. He was used to fear. He thrived on it. "I said, give me the papers, boy. Don't play games with me." Isaiah's jaw tightened at the word boy, but his discipline held firm. He had negotiated with warlords. A petty tyrant with a badge was nothing. "I am informing you of where my items are so there are no misunderstandings when I reach for them," Isaiah stated calmly. Slowly telegraphing every movement, he moved his right hand toward his back pocket. "Keep your hands on the wheel," Wasson suddenly roared, unholstering his weapon and pointing it directly at Isaiah's chest. On the other side, Cobb drew his weapon as well, his hands shaking. I said keep your hands where I can see them. You asked for my license," Isaiah said, his hands immediately returning to the steering wheel, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the undeniable weight of command. "Lower your weapon, officer. There is no threat here." Tell me exactly what you want me to do. Step out of the vehicle. Now, Lawson screamed, his face turning red with fabricated rage. Isaiah didn't argue. He knew how these situations escalated on dark roads with no cameras. Slowly, he opened the door and stepped out into the pouring rain. He towered over Lawson, standing a broad-shouldered 6'3", which only seemed to enrage the officer further. Before Isaiah could completely plant his feet on the asphalt, Lawson grabbed him roughly by the shoulder of his hoodie and violently shoved him forward. Isaiah's chest hit the cold, wet hood of the Bronco. He could have stopped it. With a fraction of his training, he could have disarmed Lawson, incapacitated Cobb, and secured the scene in under 10 seconds. But he was a man of the law, a senior military officer. He let it happen, absorbing the impact. "Hands behind your back," Lawson ordered, grabbing Isaiah's left arm and wrenching it upward at a painful, unnatural angle. The cold metal of the handcuffs ratcheted brutally tight around Isaiah's wrists, biting into the skin. Lawson patted him down aggressively, pulling the leather wallet from Isaiah's back pocket and tossing it carelessly onto the hood of the patrol car without even opening it. "What is the reason for this stop?" Isaiah asked, his tone still terrifyingly steady. "You matched a description of an armed robbery suspect in the next county," Cobb stammered from the side, repeating a line he and Lawson had clearly used 100 times before to justify illegal searches. "A robbery suspect driving a meticulously restored bright blue vintage Bronco?" Isaiah asked, turning his head slightly to look at Lawson. "Sure. You and I both know that is a lie. I suggest you look at the ID in that wallet before you make a mistake you cannot undo." Masked, Lawson grabbed a handful of Isaiah's hoodie, pulling him away from the Bronco and slamming him back against the side of the police cruiser. "Sir, you don't tell me what to do. You don't give orders out here. You're going to the station and we're tearing this truck apart." Isaiah looked dead into Lawson's eyes. The rain ran down his face, but he didn't blink. "Officer, I'm giving you one final warning. Open the wallet, hack." Lawson laughed, a cruel, dismissive sound. He shoved Isaiah's head down and forced him into the cramped, hard plastic backseat of the cruiser. "Shut up. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you start using it." As the cruiser door slammed shut, locking him in the darkness, Isaiah let out a slow, measured breath. Inside the hidden lining of his jacket, perfectly concealed during Lawson's sloppy pat-down, his secure military-issue encrypted phone had just finished dialing a number he had activated via a tactile side button during the scuffle. The line was open, and at Fort Henry Command, they were listening to every single word. The drive to the Oak Creek Police Department was agonizingly slow, punctuated by the arrogant banter of the two officers in the front seat. They joked about the attitude of the man in the back, bragging to each other about how they were going to let him rot in a holding cell over the weekend, before charging him with resisting arrest and disorderly conduct. Isaiah sat in silence. The handcuffs were so tight his fingers were beginning to go numb, but his face betrayed nothing. He was calculating. He was evaluating the severe lack of professionalism, the clear violation of civil rights, and the absolute failure of leadership within whatever precinct these two belonged to. When the cruiser finally pulled into the loading bay of the Oak Creek station, Lawson dragged Isaiah out by the cuffs. The precinct was a tired, cinder-block building that smelled of floor wax, cheap, stale coffee, and sweat. Fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead. They hauled him to the booking desk. Desk Sergeant Toby Wyatt, an older man counting down the days to his pension, barely looked up from his computer screen. "What we got, Lawson?" Wyatt mumbled, clicking his mouse. "Combative suspect. Refused to provide ID, resisted during a lawful stop. Matched the description of the 211 up in Shelby County," Lawson recited smoothly, the lie rolling off his tongue with practiced ease. Wyatt finally looked up, his eyes sweeping over Isaiah's wet clothes and cuffed hands. He sighed, empty his pockets. Lawson dumped the contents of Isaiah's pockets onto the metal counter, a set of keys, a pack of mints, and the small velvet jewelry box containing his daughter's necklace. Lawson then tossed the leather wallet he had taken at the scene onto the pile. "Wow, the box," Lawson told Cobb. Cobb popped the velvet box open, revealing a delicate gold chain. Lawson smirked. "Probably stole that too. Tag it as evidence." Isaiah's voice cut through the room, cold and sharp as a blade. "If you tag my daughter's birthday present into an evidence locker, officer, I promise you, you will personally replace it with a year of your salary." Lawson stepped right into Isaiah's personal space. Are you threatening a police officer?" "I am stating a fact," Isaiah replied, holding the officer's gaze until Lawson felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine. Lawson couldn't quite understand it, but the man in handcuffs wasn't acting like a victim. He was acting like a predator evaluating its prey. "Put him in cell 4, Wyatt muttered, clearly wanting no part of this. "I'll run his name whenever you actually bother to open his wallet, Lawson." "I'll do it later," Lawson snapped, grabbing Isaiah's arm again. Let him cool off first." They marched Isaiah down a narrow gray hallway lined with heavy iron-barred doors. Lawson unlocked cell 4, a damp, foul-smelling concrete box with a single metal bench shoved Isaiah inside, and unhooked the cuffs. Isaiah immediately brought his arms forward, rubbing his raw, bleeding wrists, but he didn't stumble. He simply turned and faced the two officers as the heavy iron door slammed shut. "I am entitled to a phone call," Isaiah stated firmly. Lawson laughed, leaning against the bars. "You get your call when I feel like doing the paperwork. Until then, sit down and shut up." Lawson and Cobb walked away, their laughter echoing down the corridor. Isaiah waited until their footsteps faded completely. He stood in the center of the cell, perfectly still. He reached into the hidden chest lining of his hoodie and retrieved the small, matte black, encrypted device. The call he had initiated in the cruiser was still active. He brought the device to his lips. "Eagle Base, this is actual. Do you copy?" The voice that crackled back through the tiny speaker was not a standard dispatcher. It was the frantic, deadly serious voice of Major Tobias Russell, the executive officer of the 75th Ranger Regiment stationed at Fort Henry. "Colonel Crawford, sir, we copy. We have been monitoring the open line. We have your GPS coordinates triangulated. Are you injured, sir?" "Negative, Major. I am secured in a holding cell at the Oak Creek Police Department. 2 officers, Lawson and Cobb, executed a fraudulent stop, assaulted me, and confiscated my property without cause. I am currently being denied my rights and have not been properly processed." "No." There was a brief silence on the line, but the heavy, seething anger from the other side of the comms was palpable. "Understood, Colonel. General Moreau has been briefed. He was in the command center listening to the audio feed when the officer put his hands on you. The General is highly displeased, sir." A small, grim smile touched the corner of Isaiah's mouth. General Charles Moreau was a decorated war hero and a close personal mentor. He was also known to possess a temper that could melt steel. "Sir," Major Russell continued, his voice dropping into a strictly tactical register, "we are spinning up the Quick Reaction Force. You're a high-value command asset, currently being held hostage by unidentified hostile local elements. We are securing the perimeter. Major, hold the QRF to non-lethal posture. I want this handled by the book, but I want it handled with overwhelming presence. Let General Moreau take the lead." "Copy that, Colonel. ETA's 5 mics. Sit tight. Hell is coming to Oak Creek." Isaiah pocketed the phone. He walked over to the metal bench, sat down, and crossed his arms. Outside, the rain continued to beat against the tiny barred window near the ceiling. He closed his eyes, centering his breathing. The Megapolis that they had buried a nobody in the dark. They were about to find out they had just poked a sleeping dragon. Up at the front desk, Officer Lawson was leaning back in a rolling chair, drinking a terrible cup of coffee and bragging to Captain Philip Norton, the precinct's night shift commander. Norton was a tired, cynical man who usually let his officers run wild as long as it didn't create paperwork for him. "Sir, the guy gets mouthy," Lawson was saying, gesturing with his coffee cup. "Nah, wouldn't show hands, wouldn't hand over ID. Classic combative. I had to put him on the hood to secure him. We got him in cell 4. The Captain Norton sighed, rubbing his temples. "Did you run his plates, at least?" "Cobb's doing it now," Lawson said dismissively. Just then, Cobb walked out of the back room, holding a piece of printer paper. He looked pale, extremely pale. Brad? Cap? What is it, Cobb?" "Spit it out," Norton snapped. "I ran the plates on the Bronco. It didn't come back to a civilian registry." Cobb swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly. "It came back flagged by the Department of Defense. It requires a Level 5 clearance just to view the registered owner's name." Lawson stopped drinking his coffee. "What are you talking about? It's a stupid old truck. I'm telling you what the screen says." Cobb's voice went up an octave. "And I finally opened his wallet." Cobb placed the wet leather wallet on the desk. He didn't pull out the civilian driver's license. He pulled out a rigid green and white United States Armed Forces identification card. The gold foil of the eagle gleamed under the harsh precinct lights. Captain Norton snatched the card from the desk. He read the name, then he read the rank. Colonel, U.S. Army Special Operations Command. Norton's blood ran cold. He looked up at Lawson, his eyes wide with a sudden paralyzing terror. "Lawson, what exactly did you do to this man?" He was resisting," Austin stammered, the arrogant bravado evaporating in a millisecond. Before Norton could scream at his officers, a low rhythmic vibration began to hum through the concrete floor of the precinct. At first it felt like a heavy freight train passing in the distance. But it grew louder. The water in the water cooler began to ripple. The coffee in Norton's mug shook. A loud, synchronized screech of heavy tires braking sounded from the front parking lot, echoing over the relentless rain. "What the hell is that?" Wyatt, the desk sergeant, asked, standing up and looking toward the reinforced glass doors of the lobby. Outside, cutting through the darkness and the downpour, was a sight that defied belief. 4 massive, up-armored military SUVs painted in matte black had violently swerved into the small police parking lot, completely blocking all the exits. Behind them, 2 full-sized military Humvees rolled to a stop, the heavy engines growling like caged beasts. The headlights flooded the precinct lobby with blinding, brilliant white light. Lawson, Cobb, and Captain Norton froze in absolute shock. The doors of the SUVs swung open in unison. Dozens of highly trained military police officers clad in full tactical gear, Kevlar vests, and carrying unslung automatic rifles poured out into the rain. They moved with terrifying silent precision, instantly forming a secure perimeter around the entire police station. Then the rear door of the lead SUV opened. A tall, broad-chested man with silver hair stepped out into the rain. He wore a crisp, impeccably tailored army dress uniform, shielded from the rain by an umbrella held by a stern-faced aide. On his shoulders, the stars of a major general glinted ominously. This was General Charles Moreau, and he looked furious. He didn't walk. He marched toward the precinct doors, flanked by 4 heavily armed military police sergeants. Inside, Captain Norton dropped the ID card. His heart hammered in his chest like a jackhammer. "Oh my God," he whispered. "You idiots. You absolute idiots." The electronic locks on the front doors buzzed, but the soldiers didn't wait for anyone to open them. One of the MP sergeants grabbed the heavy handles and yanked the double doors open with such force that they banged violently against the lobby walls. The wind and rain rushed into the stale precinct, accompanied by the overwhelming, intimidating presence of the United States Army. General Moreau strode into the center of the lobby. His piercing eyes swept over the terrified local cops. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hum of the military vehicles idling outside. Moreau's voice, honed by decades of command, boomed through the small room, rattling the windows. "I am Major General Charles Moreau, and you have exactly 30 seconds to tell me why you have kidnapped one of my senior commanding officers before I dismantle this entire building brick by brick." The silence in the Oak Creek Police Department lobby was so absolute, so suffocatingly heavy, that the faint, erratic ticking of the wall clock sounded like a judge's gavel striking wood. Captain Philip Norton stood paralyzed behind the booking counter, the military ID card slipping from his slick, trembling fingers to land softly on the floor. Desk Sergeant Toby Wyatt had backed away until his shoulders were pressed flat against a cinder-block wall, his hands raised in a gesture of pure surrender, wanting no part of whatever apocalypse had just walked through the front doors. Major General Charles Moreau did not wait for a response. He stepped closer, his polished boots clicking sharply against the cheap linoleum floor. The four massive military police sergeants fanned out, their hands resting with practiced discipline on their tactical vests, their eyes scanning the room for any sudden movements. "I asked a question." General Moreau's voice cut through the stagnant air again, quieter this time, but laced with a lethal, icy authority that made the hairs on the back of Norton's neck stand up. "Who is the watch commander of this precinct?" Captain Norton swallowed a lump of pure terror. He forced himself to take a step forward. I am, General. Captain Philip Norton, sir." Howard's eyes locked onto Norton like a targeting laser. "Captain Norton, are you aware that you currently have Colonel Isaiah Crawford, an active duty commanding officer of the United States Army Special Operations Command, locked in one of your cages?" Sir, there has been a massive misunderstanding," Norton stammered, sweat beading on his forehead despite the chill of the rainy night. He pointed a shaking finger at the two officers who were practically trying to melt into the floor. "These two officers. They made the stop. They brought him in. I haven't even processed the paperwork yet." Officer Brandon Lawson, who had been completely stripped of his arrogant swagger, suddenly found his voice. It was pitched higher than usual, laced with the desperation of a cornered rat. He was resisting. He refused to show his hands. He fit the description of an armed robbery suspect in Shelby County. "We followed standard operating procedure." Moreau turned his gaze slowly toward Lawson. The look of profound disgust on the general's face was enough to make Lawson take an involuntary step backward. "Standard operating procedure?" Moreau repeated, his voice dangerously soft. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, rugged tablet. "Sergeant," he commanded without looking back. One of the MPs stepped forward, tapped the screen of the tablet, and synced it to a portable high-output tactical speaker attached to his chest rig. A click echoed through the lobby. Then the crisp, undeniable sound of pouring rain followed by a voice. It was Lawson's voice, recorded perfectly through the encrypted comms device Isaiah had activated. I said, "Give me the papers, boy. Don't play games with me." The color completely drained from Lawson's face. He looked like he was about to vomit. The recording continued, Isaiah's calm, measured response stating clearly where his license was. Then Lawson's sudden, fabricated rage. The sound of a scuffle, the harsh click of handcuffs, and finally, Cobb's nervous, rehearsed lie about the armed robbery suspect. Moreau signaled the MP to cut the audio. He looked back at Lawson, whose chest was heaving with panic. "An armed robbery suspect," Moreau stated flatly. A highly decorated combat veteran on his way home from purchasing a birthday present for his daughter, a man who has bled for this country in places you could not point to on a map. You dragged him out of his vehicle, assaulted him, and called him boy. Moreau took one step toward Lawson. Despite being 20 years older, the general projected an aura of physical violence that made the much younger officer instinctively flinch. "You did not stop him because he fit a description, Officer Lawson," Moreau said, his voice dropping to a terrifying whisper. You stopped him because you saw a black man driving a vintage, meticulously restored vehicle, and your fragile, pathetic ego could not handle the fact that he has achieved more in his life than you ever will. You saw a target you thought had no voice. You chose the wrong man. Lawson opened his mouth to speak, to try and construct another lie, but the words died in his throat. Moreau turned his back on him in an ultimate display of dismissal and looked at Captain Norton. Take me to him, now, or my men will tear these doors off their hinges and find him themselves. Norton didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy ring of iron keys from the desk and practically ran toward the secure hallway. Right this way, General, right away. The procession marched down the gray corridor. Norton's hands were shaking so violently that it took him 3 tries to get the heavy brass key into the lock of cell 4. When the deadbolt finally slid back with a loud clank, Norton pulled the heavy iron-barred door open and stepped aside, keeping his eyes glued to the floor. Inside the damp, foul-smelling concrete box, Colonel Isaiah Crawford was sitting on the metal bench. His hands rested on his knees, his posture perfectly straight. His wrists were raw, bleeding freely from the excessively tight cuffs, and a dark bruise was already forming on his left cheekbone where Lawson had slammed him against the hood of the cruiser. Despite his condition, the moment General Moreau stepped into the doorway, Isaiah stood up. He brought his right hand up in a crisp, textbook salute, ignoring the searing pain in his wrist. "General Moreau, sir," Isaiah said, his voice as calm and steady as it had been on the highway. Moreau immediately returned the salute. The harshness in his eyes softened, replaced by a deep, fatherly respect. "Stand down, Isaiah," Moreau said quietly. "Are you badly injured?" "Superficial abrasions, sir." "Nothing broken," Isaiah replied, lowering his hand. "I apologize for dragging you out in the rain, General." "Nonsense, Colonel. We were listening to the comms feed. You showed an incredible amount of restraint," Moreau said, stepping aside to let 2 MP combat medics rush into the cell. They immediately began treating Isaiah's wrists with antiseptic wipes and bandages. Moreau looked around the filthy cell, his jaw tightening again. He turned to Captain Norton, who was hovering nervously in the hallway. "Captain," Moreau said, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "You have exactly 5 minutes to return Colonel Crawford's personal belongings, and then you and I are going to have a very long conversation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Norton gasped. "The FBI? General, please, this is a local matter. We can discipline Lawson internally." "This stopped being a local matter the second your men put their hands on a federal officer and violated his civil rights," Moreau interrupted, his tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "The storm hasn't even started yet, Captain." Back in the main lobby, the situation was rapidly deteriorating for the Oak Creek Police Department. Officer Derek Kolb, a man who had spent his short career blindly riding Lawson's coattails, was finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of what they had done. He was sitting on a plastic waiting room chair, his head buried in his hands, quietly sobbing. Lawson, however, was pacing. He was pacing like a caged animal, his mind desperately spinning to find a way out, to find a loophole, to find someone to blame. "We have union reps," Lawson muttered to Wyatt, who pointedly ignored him. "They can just storm in here. This is a jurisdiction violation. We're local law enforcement. They can't do this." As the heavy double doors of the lobby swung open again. If the arrival of the military police had been a shock, the arrival of the 3 men in dark suits and windbreakers was the final nail in the coffin. The windbreakers bore the bold yellow letters, FBI. Leading the trio was Special Agent in Charge, Christopher Langdon, a man known in the regional DOJ office as a meticulous, unforgiving bulldog when it came to civil rights violations and police corruption. He walked in carrying a thick stack of manila folders, flanked by 2 heavily armed federal agents. Moreau emerged from the secure hallway, walking side by side with Colonel Isaiah Crawford, whose wrists were now wrapped in white gauze. "Agent Langdon," "Nunk," Moreau called out, acknowledging the FBI agent. "General Moreau," Langdon nodded respectfully. "We receive your transmission. A federal judge signed the warrants 10 minutes ago." Langdon walked directly to the booking desk. He slapped the stack of folders onto the counter with a loud smack. Captain Norton flinched. "Captain Norton," Langdon said briskly, not bothering with pleasantries. "I'm Special Agent Langdon, Department of Justice. As of this exact moment, the Federal Bureau of Investigation is taking over this precinct. We have federal warrants to seize all data servers, computer terminals, dispatch audio, body camera footage, and dashcam recordings." You're taking over the station?" Wharton asked, his voice cracking. "To ensure no evidence is accidentally lost or corrupted," Langdon replied dryly. He turned his attention to the two officers in the corner, Officers Brandon Lawson and Derek Cobb. Lawson stopped pacing. His heart dropped into his stomach. "Step forward," Langdon ordered. When neither man moved, the two federal agents stepped up behind them, placing firm hands on their shoulders and physically marching them to the center of the room. "Officer Brandon Lawson," Langdon read from a document in his hand. "You are currently under investigation for multiple federal offenses, including Title 18, UNA, SC Section 2422 Bastion of Rights under color of law, aggravated assault, kidnapping, and the unlawful detention of a federal officer. Your partner is facing accessory charges." "Kidnapping?" Lawson shouted, his face turning a blotchy red. "It was a traffic stop. You can't charge me with kidnapping." When you place a citizen in handcuffs under entirely fabricated pretenses, forcefully remove them from their vehicle, and lock them in a cell without a shred of legal justification, that is the legal definition of kidnapping, Lawson," Langdon stated coldly. "So operated outside the bounds of your authority. Therefore, you were not acting as a police officer tonight. You were acting as an armed thug." Langdon looked at Captain Norton. "Captain, I suggest you relieve these men of their duties immediately before I arrest you for aiding and abetting." Norton, realizing his own pension and freedom were now on the line, didn't hesitate. He stepped out from behind the desk. Lawson, Cobb, badges and weapons, on the desk. Now. Cobb immediately unbuckled his duty belt. His hand shook so violently that it clattered loudly onto the metal desk. He unpinned his silver badge and set it next to his gun, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," Cobb whispered to no one in particular. I just did what Brad told me to do." Lawson, however, stood frozen. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darting wildly between the FBI agents, the imposing military police, and General Moreau. The reality was crushing him. The badge that had been his shield, his excuse to bully and terrorize, was being stripped away. "Lawson, I will not ask you again," Norton growled, finally showing a spark of backbone now that his own neck was on the chopping block. Slowly, his hands trembling with a mixture of rage and profound fear, Lawson unclipped his belt. He placed his Glock on the desk, followed by his taser, his radio, and finally his badge. The metal star made a hollow, definitive sound as it hit the counter. "Turn around," one of the federal agents instructed. Lawson blinked, confused. "What?" "Turn around and put your hand behind your back," the agent repeated, pulling a pair of heavy, steel Smith & Wesson handcuffs from his belt. "No, wait, I'm a cop," and Lawson pleaded, the arrogance finally entirely broken. "You can't do this. I have a family." "So does the man you assaulted," Langdon replied without an ounce of sympathy. The federal agent grabbed Lawson's arm, twisting it behind his back with practiced efficiency, and snapped the handcuffs tightly over his wrists. The sharp click echoed in the lobby. The irony was suffocating. While the arrest was taking place, Desk Sergeant Wyatt had hastily gathered Isaiah's belongings into a clear plastic property bag. He walked over to Isaiah, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "Your belongings, Colonel. We We didn't tag any of it. Isaiah took the bag. He reached inside and pulled out the small velvet jewelry box. He opened it, ensuring the delicate gold chain inside was untouched. He snapped it shut and slipped it safely into the chest pocket of his hoodie. Isaiah then walked slowly across the lobby, his boots silent on the linoleum, until he stood directly in front of a handcuffed, hyperventilating Brandon Lawson. The room fell dead silent. Even the MPs and the FBI agents paused to watch the interaction. Isaiah looked down at the disgraced officer. There was no rage in Isaiah's eyes, no bloating. There was only a cold, unyielding judgment that cut deeper than any physical blow. "You told me I didn't give orders out here," Isaiah said, his voice low, steady, and echoing with finality. You thought you owned the darkness. You thought the badge gave you permission to be a predator." Lawson could meet Isaiah's eyes. He looked at the floor, his breathing ragged. "But the truth is, Lawson, you are a coward," Isaiah continued calmly. "You prey on those you believe are weak to hide how incredibly small you are. But tonight, you pulled over the wrong man, and you brought the light down on yourself." Isaiah turned his back on him, dismissing him entirely, and looked at Agent Langdon. Agent, he is all yours." Langdon nodded. He grabbed Lawson by the bicep. "Let's go, Lawson. You know the way." Langdon marched the disgraced officer down the grey corridor. They stopped at the end of the hall. Langdon opened the heavy iron door of cell 4, the exact same damp, foul-smelling box Lawson had gleefully thrown Isaiah into less than an hour ago. "Get in," Langdon ordered. Lawson stumbled into the cell. He turned around, his eyes wide and terrified, as Langdon grabbed the iron bars and pulled the door shut. The heavy deadbolt slid into place with a deafening metallic clang. Lawson sank onto the cold metal bench, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing mercilessly overhead, realizing with absolute chilling certainty that his life as he knew it was entirely over. The atmosphere inside the Oak Creek Police Department had shifted from a scene of arrogant dominance to one of complete, catastrophic dismantling. Special Agent in charge, Christopher Langdon, did not just intend to arrest Brandon Lawson, he intended to rip the precinct down to its foundational studs. Within 30 minutes of Lawson being locked in cell 4, a fleet of unmarked black vans arrived in the flooded parking lot, squeezing past the imposing military blockade. Dozens of FBI evidence response technicians wearing blue latex gloves and carrying heavy plastic bins flooded into the building. They moved with a synchronized mechanical efficiency that sent shivers down the spines of the remaining local officers. Captain Philip Norton sat heavily in a folding chair in the break room, completely stripped of his authority. 2 federal agents stood by the door, watching him closely. Norton watched through the glass partition as federal technicians systematically dismantled his precinct. They were pulling hard drives out of the dispatch computers, boxing up the physical archives, and placing bright red evidence tape over the doors to the armory and the captain's own office. But the real twist of the night was unfolding in the interrogation room, where Officer Derek Cobb was singing like a canary. Cobb, terrified of facing federal prison time alongside his former mentor, had immediately waived his right to an attorney and offered Langdon everything. As it turned out, the illegal stop of Colonel Isaiah Crawford was not an isolated incident of racial profiling and unchecked ego. It was the tip of a massive, systemic extortion ring. "It wasn't just him," Cobb stammered, his hands shaking as he held the paper cup of water provided by a federal agent. Lawson, he had a whole system. He targeted people passing through on the state route. People who didn't look like they belonged, or people who looked like they had money but wouldn't know how to fight back in court. Langdon leaned forward, a digital recorder resting on the metal table between them. "Explain the system, Cobb. Detail it. Civil asset forfeiture," Cobb whispered, staring at the table. Lawson would make a bogus stop. He'd claim he smelled narcotics, all match them to a fake description. Then he'd confiscate their cash, their jewelry, sometimes even impound their vehicles, claiming it was suspected proceeds of a crime. He knew most out-of-towners wouldn't pay thousands of dollars in legal fees to fight for a few $100 or a watch. The department kept a percentage, but Lawson skinned off the top. He has a lockbox in his garage. Ungden's eyes narrowed. This had just escalated from a civil rights violation to a sprawling federal racketeering and corruption case. Give me a name, Cobb. Give me one specific victim he did this to. Cobb swallowed hard. A guy named Benjamin Hughes. It happened last November. Hughes was a retired school teacher moving down south. He had $10,000 in cash in his trunk to buy a used RV. Lawson pulled him over, planted a used pipe in the back seat, and seized the cash. The old man tried to fight it, but Norton buried the complaints. Hughes lost everything. Langdon stood up, his expression hardening into a mask of pure, righteous fury. Agent Ross, Langdon said to the man standing by the door. Got a secondary warrant for Lawson's personal residence. I want his house torn apart. I want the floorboards ripped up. If there's a dime of stolen money in that house, I want it. Out in the lobby, the United States Army was preparing to withdraw. Their objective was complete. Their commanding officer was secure. General Charles Moreau stood near the shattered front doors, the rain still pouring outside, though the thunder had finally begun to fade. He turned to Isaiah, who was quietly watching the FBI technicians box up the precinct's corrupt history. You did well tonight, Isaiah, Moreau said softly, his voice carrying the weight of a proud mentor. The lesser man would have put that officer through the windshield of his own cruiser. You held your fire, and because of that, you've exposed a cancer that's been eating this county alive. Isaiah adjusted the cuffs of his hoodie, wincing slightly as the fabric brushed against his bandaged wrists. The uniform means we are held to a higher standard, General, even when we aren't wearing it. I couldn't let him drag me down to his level, but I won't lie to you, it took everything I had to keep my hands on that steering wheel. Moreau placed a firm, reassuring hand on Isaiah's shoulder. Go home, Colonel. Your men will drive your vehicle back to base for you. I have a detail waiting to take you to your family. Take a 72-hour leave. That is a direct order. Yes, sir, Isaiah replied, a genuine smile finally breaking through his stoic demeanor. As Isaiah walked out of the precinct and climbed into the back of an idling black military SUV, he glanced back at the cinderblock building. Through the small barred window of Cell 4, he could just make out the shadowy silhouette of Brandon Lawson, sitting with his head in his hands, entirely alone in the dark. The hunter had officially become the hunted. The SUV pulled away, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt, leaving the storm and the shattered precinct behind. An hour later, the sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the quiet suburban streets of Isaiah's neighborhood. The military vehicle pulled silently into his driveway. Isaiah stepped out, thanked the driver, and walked up to his front door. He unlocked the door and stepped into the quiet, familiar warmth of his home. The smell of vanilla and coffee lingered in the air. He snipped off his boots and walked down the hallway to his daughter's bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. Maya, his 16-year-old daughter, was fast asleep, her breathing steady and peaceful. Isaiah leaned against the doorframe, reaching into his chest pocket. His fingers brushed the velvet box. He had faced down warlords in the desert and corrupt cops on dark highways, all to ensure that this exact moment this peace remained unbroken. He walked quietly into the room, placed the velvet box on her nightstand where she would see it the moment she woke up, and kissed her forehead. Happy birthday, sweetheart, he whispered. The wheels of justice are often slow, but when the full weight of the federal government, propelled by the fury of the United States military, presses down on the pedal, they move with terrifying speed. 7 months later, the federal courthouse in downtown was completely swarmed by local and national news rants. The story had leaked within days of the arrest. Local police kidnap active duty Special Forces commander FBI uncovers massive extortion ring. It was a public relations nightmare that had sent shockwaves across the entire state. Inside courtroom 302, the air was heavily air-conditioned and smelled of polished wood and nervous sweat. The gallery was packed to absolute capacity. Sitting in the front row was Benjamin Hughes, the retired schoolteacher Cobb had mentioned, along with nearly a dozen other victims who'd been terrorized, robbed, and framed by the Oak Creek Police Department. Sitting at the defense table was Brandon Lawson. He was completely unrecognizable from the arrogant, chest-puffing bully who had swaggered down the rain-slicked highway. Lawson had lost 30 pounds. His skin was pale, his hair was thinning, and he wore an oversized, bright orange federal inmate jumpsuit. His wrists and ankles were bound in heavy steel chains. His arrogance had been replaced by a hollow, consuming terror. Beside him sat his public defender. Lawson's wife had divorced him 3 months into the investigation, taking their children and completely draining his legitimate bank accounts to pay for her relocation. The police union, terrified of the FBI's sprawling racketeering probe, had publicly disavowed him and refused to fund his legal defense. He had been left to face the hurricane entirely alone. On the prosecution side sat Special Agent Langdon and a team of LeFou federal prosecutors. The trial had been a massacre. Derek Cobb had testified against his former partner for 3 solid days, laying out exactly how they planted evidence, how they targeted minorities, and how Lawson had laughed about it over beers. The FBI introduced financial records proving Lawson had stolen over $200,000 from innocent civilians over a 5-year period. But the nail in the coffin was the audio recording from Isaiah's encrypted phone. When the prosecution played the tape in open court, Lawson's sneering, racist remarks, the physical assault, the fabricated charges, the jury members visibly recoiled in disgust. Now, it was time for sentencing. Federal Judge Amanda Collins, a no-nonsense woman with a reputation for handing down maximum sentences to corrupt public officials, stared down at Lawson from the bench. The courtroom was dead silent. "Brandon Lawson," Judge Collins began, her voice echoing through the vast room. "You were entrusted with a badge, a firearm, and the profound authority to protect the citizens of your community. Instead, you weaponized that authority. You operated not as a law enforcement officer, but as a predator, a thief, and a tyrant." Lawson kept his eyes glued to the defense table, tears silently rolling down his hollowed cheeks. "You targeted individuals you believed had no voice and no power to fight back," Judge Collins continued, her gaze shifting briefly to Benjamin Hughes in the gallery. "But your hubris finally caught up with you. You pulled over a man whose dedication to this country, whose discipline and whose character vastly outshines yours in every conceivable metric. Colonel Crawford's restraint exposed a deep, rotting corruption that this court will not tolerate." Judge Collins picked up a stack of papers. "On the charges of deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated assault, federal kidnapping, and racketeering, I sentence you to 22 years in a federal penitentiary. This sentence will be served without the possibility of parole." A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed immediately by quiet weeping from the victims who had finally seen justice. Lawson's knees buckled. If the U.S. Marshals hadn't been gripping his arms, he would have collapsed onto the courtroom floor. 22 years. He would be an old, broken man before he ever saw the outside of a cell again. "Furthermore," Judge Collins added, her voice cutting through the murmurs, "as a result of the federal consent decree resulting from this investigation, the Oak Creek Police Department is hereby permanently disbanded. All jurisdictional duties will be absorbed by the county sheriff's office. Captain Philip Norton has accepted a plea deal of 8 years for his role in covering up your crimes. Take him away." The marshals hauled Lawson to his feet. As they turned him around to march him toward the holding cells, Lawson's eyes scanned the front row of the gallery. He stopped, sitting at the edge of the row, dressed in a sharp, impeccably tailored civilian suit, was Colonel Isaiah Crawford. Isaiah didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked at Lawson with the exact same calm, unyielding expression he had worn on the night of the arrest. It was a look that communicated a singular, terrifying truth. You chose the darkness, and the light burned you to ashes. Lawson lowered his head in utter defeat and allowed the marshals to drag him through the heavy wooden doors, vanishing from society forever. Outside the courthouse, the sun was shining brightly. Isaiah walked down the wide concrete steps, breathing in the fresh air. General Moreau was waiting for him near the curb, leaning against a black government sedan. "It's done, Colonel," Moreau said as Isaiah approached. "It's done, sir," Isaiah agreed, looking out over the bustling city. "The system works eventually, but you have to be willing to stand in the fire to make it happen." "And you stood tall," Moreau smiled. "Now I believe you have a weekend pass. Go be with your family." Isaiah nodded, returning the general's salute. He walked to his restored 1974 Ford Bronco, parked legally down the street. As he climbed into the driver's seat, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Maya. "Dad, you promised to teach me how to drive the Bronco today. Don't be late. Wearing the necklace, you got me. Love you." Isaiah smiled a genuine, deep smile that reached his eyes. The karma had been delivered. The predators had been locked away in the cages they had built for others. The scales of justice had been violently, permanently balanced. He put the Bronco in gear, merging smoothly into the traffic, heading toward the only place that truly mattered. Home. What a satisfying absolute reckoning. This story proves that true power doesn't come from a badge or a loud voice. It comes from quiet discipline, unshakable integrity, and the courage to stand your ground. Officer Lawson thought he was the ultimate predator of the night, only to discover he had cornered a military titan who brought the full weight of justice crashing down on his corrupt empire. It's a stark reminder that karma rarely misses, and when you abuse your power to harm the innocent, the universe has a brutal way of balancing the scales. If this story of poetic justice and military karma gave you chills, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who loves a perfect revenge story. And don't forget to subscribe for more incredible, real-life, inspired tales of justice served cold. Let us know in the comments what you thought at the general's entrance.